Welcome to Momentum Mind, the place where ideas meet action, and your mindset becomes your superpower. Here, we break down the world's most powerful books, principles, and strategies into stories you can see, feel, and use in your own life. Whether you want to sharpen your thinking, master your habits, or unlock your full potential, you're in the right place. Today, we're diving deep into a story that will change the way you see challenges, decisions, and success. Let's jump in. Chapter 1: The boy who watched the ticker in the quiet town of Manhasset, where the wind carried the smell of the sea and the nights hummed with the faint rhythm of crickets. A boy sat cross-legged on the living room floor. The glow from the television flickered over his face as numbers rolled across the bottom of the screen, tiny, pulsing symbols of something mysterious and alive. His name was Ray. He didn't fully understand what those numbers meant, but he felt their pull, as if they were whispers from a secret world hidden behind glass and steel. His father was a jazz musician, a man whose soul danced with improvisation, whose eyes lit up whenever the rhythm found him. His mother kept the family steady, her hands always busy, her voice soft but firm. Their home was not grand, but it was alive with warmth and rhythm. Music filled it, laughter drifted through it, and yet, for young Ray, it was those numbers, the ones gliding across the black screen, that felt like the melody of something greater. He began asking questions, endless ones. What are stocks? Why do they go up and down? Who decides what they're worth? His parents didn't have answers. So he found his own. He wandered through the local library, the smell of old paper and dust wrapping around him like an invisible fog. He flipped through newspapers, staring at columns of tickers, tracing them with his fingers as if they were a code he could learn to read. And then one summer, as sunlight poured through the leaves, he took his first leap. He was barely a teenager when he bought his first stock, shares of a company he'd heard about on television. It wasn't logic that drove him. It was curiosity. He liked the name of the company. It sounded bold. Confident. So he gathered what little money he had from mowing lawns and delivering newspapers, walked into a brokerage office, and placed his order. He waited. The days passed slowly, each one stretching like a tightrope of anticipation. When the news finally came that his stock had tripled, he stared in disbelief. He felt a jolt of triumph, his first taste of the game. To him, it wasn't luck. It was proof that he could see something others couldn't. But deep down, he knew he didn't understand why it happened. And that quiet ignorance, it both thrilled and haunted him. School couldn't hold him. His teachers talked about rules and facts, but Ray was hungry for patterns and meaning. He watched markets the way a sailor watches the tides, learning when they rose, when they fell, and what invisible forces pushed them. On weekends, while other kids played ball, he stood in front of the TV with a notebook, writing down prices, watching how they breathed. Then came the noise of the city. When Ray left for college, he entered a world that pulsed faster than he ever imagined. New York City, restless, ambitious, merciless. Skyscrapers loomed like monuments to those who had figured out the game, who had learned to bend risk into reward. He walked among them, feeling small but alive. At night, the city lights glowed like constellations scattered by human hands. In dorm rooms thick with the smell of coffee and cigarette smoke, students debated politics, economics, and philosophy. But Ray wasn't drawn to theories. He wanted reality. He wanted to understand how people made decisions, how fear and greed moved through the veins of the market like electricity. When he began trading again, he did it with the confidence of youth. He believed he could predict outcomes. Sometimes he was right, often, gloriously right. Other times, he was wrong, but those moments slid past him, unnoticed. Success has a way of disguising ignorance, and Ray, like so many before him, mistook luck for skill. Years passed in a blur of deals, numbers, and rising ambition. He joined Wall Street, and the floor was chaos, a battlefield of voices, paper, and sweat. Phones rang like alarm bells. Men shouted over one another, waving slips of paper in the air, their faces glowing red with urgency. Ray thrived in it. The noise felt like home. The market's heartbeat matched his own, but beneath the excitement, something was missing. He began to notice how often people acted without thinking, how arrogance disguised itself as certainty. He saw fortunes made and lost in a single day, not because of knowledge, but because of emotion. And that realization cut deep. He started keeping a journal. Each night, long after the trading floor had gone silent, he would write. Not about profits or losses, but about why things happened. Why he made certain choices. Why others made different ones. Slowly, he began to see a pattern emerging, not in the markets, but in himself. Then came the storm. It started small, like a tremor beneath his feet. A prediction. Ray was convinced a major economic collapse was coming. The data pointed one way, his instincts another. He told his clients, his colleagues, anyone who would listen. He believed he was right, he had to be right, but when the moment came, the world did not collapse. The markets rose. The economy surged forward, mocking his prediction. And in an instant, everything he'd built crumbled. Bridgewater, the firm he had poured his soul into, fell apart. His clients withdrew. His savings vanished. His reputation dissolved like mist. He was left with almost nothing, sitting in a small office that used to be full of people, now quiet except for the hum of a single lamp. That silence was heavier than any loss he had known. He had built a world out of confidence, and now it had turned to dust. For the first time in his life, Ray was forced to face the truth. He didn't know as much as he thought he did. He had been wrong. Completely, publicly, painfully wrong. There was a day when he couldn't pay his bills. He had to borrow money just to survive. He felt shame burn through him, sharper than failure. But as he sat in that small room, surrounded by stacks of empty folders and memories of what once was, something strange happened. He began to feel clear. The noise was gone. The pride, the rush, the illusions, all stripped away. And in that emptiness, something began to form. A thought. A principle. If he could understand why he failed, maybe he could learn how never to fail the same way again. That night, he reopened his journal. His hand trembled as he began to write, not about markets this time, but about life itself. About mistakes, pain, truth, and growth. The pen scratched across the page as the moonlight spilled over his desk. Outside, the city moved on, uncaring. But inside that tiny room, something was being born, a new way of seeing the world, and as the first light of morning crept through the blinds, Ray looked at the words he had written and whispered to himself, I have to find a better way. He didn't know it yet, but those words would become the seed of everything that followed, and somewhere deep inside him, a quiet fire began to burn again, smaller this time, steadier, but infinitely more powerful. Chapter 2, The Ashes of Certainty. The air in Ray's apartment was heavy with stillness. The kind that comes after a storm has torn through and left everything quiet, not peaceful, but hollow. The furniture was plain, the walls bare, the desk crowded with notes and coffee-stained papers. The only thing that broke the silence was the faint ticking of a clock on the wall, each second reminding him of how far he had fallen. He would wake early, not because he was rested, but because his thoughts wouldn't let him sleep. They pressed against his mind like waves, whispering of everything he had lost. His firm. His money. His confidence. Sometimes, in those early hours, he would just sit at the window and stare at the city below. Cars moved like blood through its veins, unstoppable, uncaring. He used to believe he was part of that rhythm. Now, he watched it from a distance, like an outsider, but something inside him refused to die. The collapse had burned away the illusion that he always knew what he was doing. What remained was fragile, but it was honest. He began to rebuild, not his company yet, but himself. Every morning, he opened his notebook and wrote. Thoughts. Questions. Memories. Why did I believe I was right? Why didn't I test my ideas harder? Why did I let my emotions decide what logic should have ruled? The more he wrote, the clearer he saw, the enemy wasn't the market. It was his own mind. His blind spots. His certainty. He started reading again, not about stocks, but about people. About how we think, how we fail, how we lie to ourselves without realizing it. He studied psychology, history, philosophy, anything that could help him understand why people, including himself, kept making the same mistakes. He began to see life differently. Every decision, every failure, was part of a pattern, a loop. Pain, he realized, wasn't something to avoid. It was the signal. It was feedback. It showed him where to look. One evening, he wrote a line that would change everything. Pain plus reflection equals progress. It wasn't meant to be profound. It was just true. He had lived it. Slowly, he began to test his new way of thinking. He would make a decision, watch what happened, feel the pain of the outcome, then write down what he learned. He wasn't trading much yet, but he was training something deeper, his awareness. He was building his own operating system for life. Still, the world outside didn't wait for him. Bills kept coming. His savings were gone. The phone didn't ring anymore. Some nights, he wondered if he was fooling himself, if he was just another dreamer trying to justify failure. But each time that thought appeared, he countered it with work, and then, slowly, something began to change. A few old clients called back, not many, but enough to give him hope. They trusted his honesty, even if he'd been wrong before. They could feel that he was different now. less arrogant, more methodical, more real. Ray didn't promise them success. He promised them truth. He told them what he knew, what he didn't, and how he would find out. That honesty became his new currency. He started rebuilding Bridgewater, not as a company of noise and ego, but as a laboratory for thinking. The first meetings were held around a small table in his apartment. Coffee cups, notebooks, and endless questions filled the space. He encouraged everyone to speak freely, to challenge him. "Don't agree with me just because I'm the boss," he said. "If you think I'm wrong, say so." At first, people hesitated. But when he truly listened, when he didn't punish disagreement, they began to open up. One morning, an employee disagreed with one of his ideas during a meeting. The room went silent. Everyone waited for Ray's reaction. But instead of arguing, he asked calmly, "Why do you think that?" The discussion that followed lasted for hours. Charts were drawn, assumptions tested, ideas stripped bare. By the end, Ray realized the employee was right, and he said so. That moment marked a shift. Truth had become more important than ego. He began to build a system around it. Every decision, every prediction, every disagreement was recorded. Mistakes were not hidden, they were studied. They became data, lessons, stepping stones. Bridgewater slowly evolved into something no one had seen before, a company that treated thinking like a science, but the change wasn't easy. The people closest to him struggled with the new culture. Radical transparency, as he called it, was uncomfortable. It forced everyone, including him, to face uncomfortable truths. There were arguments. Tears, even. People left. But those who stayed understood that they were building something bigger than themselves, a way of working that might just outlast them all. Ray, however, still carried a quiet fear. He had rebuilt before, only to fall again. What if it happened once more? What if this was just another illusion? He didn't know yet that fear was part of the process. That the difference now wasn't in the outcome, it was in how he would handle it. One night, as the team worked late, rain tapping softly against the windows, Ray stared at a chart glowing on his computer screen. The market had done something unexpected again, something no one could have predicted. His team waited for him to speak, to make the call. He took a breath and said, "Let's test every assumption we have. Every single one." They worked through the night, dissecting data, arguing, finding holes in their reasoning. The air buzzed with focus and fatigue. When dawn broke, they had found it, a small error in the logic that had changed everything. It was in that moment, surrounded by tired but smiling faces, that Ray understood what he had created. Not just a company. A way of being. A way of facing the world without illusions. He looked around the room, at the team that had chosen to stay, and said quietly, "If we can think clearly together, we can solve anything." The sun rose over the city, golden light spilling across the desks. It was a new day. And for the first time in a long time, Ray felt something stronger than confidence. He felt conviction. But just as Bridgewater began to grow, as its reputation spread and its methods attracted the attention of powerful clients, a new challenge started to form on the horizon, one that would test not just his principles, but the very soul of the company he was building. And somewhere deep inside, he could already feel the tension building again. Chapter 3, The Culture of Truth. The morning light crept through the tall windows of Bridgewater's new office, spilling across rows of desks lined with papers, coffee mugs, and computers humming softly like restless minds. The sound of typing, low conversations, and the occasional sharp laugh filled the air. It wasn't like any other financial firm. There was no polished silence, no pretense of certainty. Instead, there was friction, creative, relentless friction. Ray walked through the office slowly, his expression calm but his eyes sharp. He watched people argue openly at whiteboards, pointing, debating, dissecting ideas as if truth itself were the prize. And in a way, this was his creation now, his living experiment. Bridgewater was no longer just a hedge fund. It was a living system designed to test ideas and expose weakness, even when that weakness was his own. Every decision, every conversation was recorded. Cameras and microphones captured meetings so that no thought, no reaction, no mistake would be lost to memory. Employees could replay them, analyze them, learn from them. For some, it was exhilarating, a place where honesty wasn't punished but demanded. For others, it was suffocating, like living under a constant spotlight. At the center of it all stood the rule that defined everything: radical truth and radical transparency. No one, not even Ray, was above scrutiny. If he made a poor decision, anyone in the company, no matter how new or young, had the right, even the responsibility, to question him. It was terrifying and liberating all at once. There was a day when a young analyst, barely out of school, challenged him during a meeting. The topic was a market forecast, one Ray had worked on for days. The analyst raised his hand and said, "I think you might be missing a key variable." The room went still. Ray looked at him. "Explain." The young man did, voice steady, reasoning sharp. When he finished, Ray nodded slowly, then turned to the others. "He's right." He meant it. And the analyst never forgot that moment, the way the founder of one of the biggest funds in the world had treated him not as a subordinate, but as an equal in the pursuit of truth. But not everyone could handle it. Some broke under the weight of constant evaluation. Every employee received ratings given by their peers after meetings, assessing how they thought, how they communicated, how open they were to new ideas. These built a digital profile, a portrait of their strengths and weaknesses. It was precise. It was scientific. And it was merciless. Ray saw it as a mirror, a way to confront reality, no matter how uncomfortable. "You can't improve if you don't know what's real," he would say. But others saw it as invasive, even cruel. They whispered in corners, wondering if they were being watched, judged, measured. The tension grew. One evening, as the office emptied and the lights dimmed, Ray stood by the window, looking down at the city. His reflection in the glass seemed older, heavier. Behind him, a senior partner hesitated before speaking. "Ray," he said softly, "some of the people think this culture is too intense. They're afraid to speak freely, not because of you, but because everything is so exposed." Ray turned, his gaze thoughtful. "You think truth is too much?" "I think people need room to breathe. To feel safe." Ray nodded slowly. He understood. But he also knew that comfort was the enemy of growth. "If they can't face reality here," he said, "how will they face it out there?" Still, that night, he couldn't shake the words. As he walked home through the quiet streets, he thought about the line between truth and cruelty. He wanted Bridgewater to be a place where people became stronger through honesty, but was he building a forge or a fire? The next day, he gathered the team. They sat in a circle, the hum of the city faint beyond the glass. "I need all of you to tell me what's wrong," he said. "Not with the company. With me." There was hesitation. No one wanted to be the first. Then one voice spoke up, trembling but clear. "Sometimes," a woman said, "you're too direct. You don't realize how harsh it feels when you point out mistakes." Ray listened. The words stung, but he wrote them down. "Good," he said. "Keep going." More voices followed, careful at first, then bolder. They talked about the culture, the pressure, the fear of being constantly rated. Ray absorbed it all like a man taking inventory of his own reflection. When they finished, he looked around and smiled faintly. "That," he said, "is what radical truth feels like." There was laughter, some of it nervous, but something in the air had shifted. The walls of fear had cracked a little. From then on, Bridgewater became even more open, but also more human. Ray began to talk more about meaning, about purpose. "Money," he said during one meeting, "is just a byproduct of doing things right. What matters is that we're learning, always learning." He introduced new principles, guidelines not for making money, but for making decisions, for living. They spread through the company like seeds. People began to use them in their personal lives, in relationships, even in how they thought about themselves. But with growth came attention. Journalists began to write about Bridgewater, calling it the most secretive hedge fund in the world and a cult of radical transparency. Outsiders were fascinated, suspicious, curious. Some praised the system. Others mocked it. Ray didn't care much about the noise. He believed that if you built something based on truth, the results would speak for themselves. And they did. Bridgewater's performance began to soar. Its reputation grew. Its influence spread across the financial world like wildfire. But success brings new kinds of danger, the quiet ones that creep in unseen. Pride. Complacency. Overconfidence. One evening, during a leadership meeting, an argument erupted between two senior members. It started small, over data accuracy, but quickly spiraled into something personal. Words were sharp. One of them stormed out, slamming the door behind him. The silence that followed was suffocating. Ray sat there, staring at the empty chair. He had built a place where people could challenge ideas, but now they were challenging each other. The system that was meant to unite them through truth was beginning to divide them through ego. Later that night, long after everyone had gone home, he sat alone in the darkened office. The glow of the city flickered on his face as he opened his notebook once more. He wrote, "Radical truth works only when driven by radical love." He leaned back in his chair, eyes closed, realizing that the greatest challenge wasn't creating a culture of truth, it was creating a culture of understanding, and as Bridgewater climbed to heights few firms had ever reached, Ray knew that somewhere in those shining towers of success, a crack was forming, one that would soon test not just his company, but everything he believed in. Chapter 4: The Machine of Reality. The office was quiet when Ray arrived before dawn. The world outside was still asleep, but inside his mind, thoughts were already turning like gears. He placed his worn leather notebook on the desk, poured a black coffee, and stared out the window at the horizon. The city lights blinked like neurons firing in a vast, restless brain. He had begun to see everything, markets, people, decisions, as part of a single, immense machine. Each part connected, every movement causing another. He couldn't unsee it now. It was as if reality itself had lifted a veil, revealing its hidden patterns. To most, life felt chaotic, random. To Ray, it was structured, logical, but only if you could see the connections. The trick, he believed, was to stop reacting and start observing. To step back far enough to see the whole system moving at once. He wrote a line in his notebook: everything is a machine. The economy. The company. You. Me. It wasn't arrogance. It was clarity. If he could understand how the machine worked, he could understand how to move through it without breaking. At Bridgewater, he began to teach this way of thinking. He gathered his team in the conference room, the whiteboards already filled with diagrams, arrows, circles, loops connecting cause and effect. Everything that happens, he said, tapping the board, is a result of something that came before. If you can see the cause, you can predict the effect. And if you can predict the effect, you can shape it. His team leaned forward, watching him draw a flow of logic that turned markets into anatomy, decisions into physics. But Ray's machine wasn't just about money. It was about life itself. When someone at Bridgewater made a mistake, he didn't see it as failure. He saw it as a malfunction in the system, a signal to study. Pain plus reflection equals progress, he reminded them. If something hurts, it means the machine is showing you where it's weak. He treated his own life the same way. Every argument with a friend, every conflict at work, every frustration, he mapped them, analyzed them, tried to find the underlying mechanism. Why did people react the way they did? Why did emotions override reason? What made someone blind to their own mistakes? The more he studied, the clearer his philosophy became. People themselves were machines made of thoughts, emotions, and habits. And yet, most didn't know how to operate their own systems. He began creating what he called principles, the hidden codes that made the machine run smoothly. Whenever he discovered a truth that held up under pressure, he wrote it down. When it failed, he rewrote it. Each principle was tested like a gear in motion. One night, after everyone had gone home, Ray sat surrounded by pages of these principles, scattered like constellations across his desk. He rubbed his temples, exhausted but exhilarated. If I can understand how everything works, he whispered to himself, I can live better. I can make better choices. I can help others do the same. But understanding the machine came with a cost. He began to see how predictable people could be, how fear, ego, and bias repeated the same patterns over and over. It made him more patient, but also more detached. Sometimes, when he spoke, others felt like he was analyzing them rather than hearing them. One afternoon, during a tense meeting, a colleague snapped, "We're not machines, Ray. We're people." The words hung in the air. Ray stared at him for a long moment before answering softly, "I know. But people are part of the machine, whether they see it or not." Still, that night, he couldn't shake the discomfort. He realized that his obsession with understanding had begun to distance him from the very thing he wanted to help, people. He started walking more, thinking more. Long walks along the river, where the sound of the water seemed to mirror the rhythm of his thoughts. The wind carried the smell of salt and city, and he found peace in the balance between chaos and order. He began to wonder if maybe the machine wasn't cold or mechanical at all, maybe it was alive. Maybe reality wasn't something to control, but something to cooperate with. In those moments, he felt something almost spiritual stirring inside him. Not belief in something divine, but in the elegance of how everything fit together. The rise and fall of economies. The growth and decay of life. The endless cycles of success and failure, joy and loss. It was all connected. It all made sense, if you looked close enough, and far enough. Back at Bridgewater, the principles evolved. Meetings became less about opinions and more about logic. Employees debated not from ego, but from data. Every conclusion had to survive the same test. Does it make sense in the machine of reality? The results were astonishing. The firm's strategies became sharper, more resilient. They began to see patterns others couldn't, predict shifts others missed. Success followed, steady and inevitable, but success brought attention. The world started noticing the strange firm in Connecticut that ran on radical transparency and algorithmic thinking. Reporters wrote about their unusual culture, their obsession with data, their near-religious devotion to principles. Some admired them. Others called them cold. Ray didn't mind. What mattered was that it worked, yet deep down, he knew something the world didn't. Even the best machine breaks. No system, no matter how perfect, can escape the unpredictability of human emotion. One evening, as the team celebrated another milestone, laughter and champagne filling the air, Ray stood apart by the window. The city beyond glowed golden, but his reflection in the glass looked distant. He thought of his family, his wife, his sons, of the quiet moments he often missed chasing patterns and answers. He wondered if, in trying to understand everything, he was slowly losing touch with what truly mattered. Behind him, his team toasted to success. Someone clapped him on the shoulder, pulling him back into the room. He smiled, but the thought lingered like a shadow. The machine of reality worked perfectly, until it collided with the machine of the heart, and soon, those two forces would meet in ways that would shake everything he had built. Chapter 5: The Mirror of the Mind. The early morning sun crept into Ray's study, painting the walls with soft gold light. He sat alone, notebook open, coffee cooling at his side, staring at the blank page. The world outside had begun its daily rush, cars honking, people moving, markets waking, but inside, a stillness gripped him. It was in these quiet hours that he confronted the most difficult machine of all, his own mind. Bridgewater had become a marvel, a place where logic and reality intertwined with rigorous discipline. Yet, for all its brilliance, Ray knew the system had limits. He had studied human behavior, dissected markets, mapped cause and effect, but one truth was undeniable: he, himself, remained unpredictable. He leaned back in his chair, thinking of the mistakes he had made over the years. The rash decisions. The moments when pride blinded him. The assumptions he hadn't questioned. Each memory was a flickering reflection, a reminder that understanding the external world was not enough. He had to understand himself. So he began what he called the inner audit. Each morning, he would review the day before, his reactions, his decisions, his emotions. He asked questions he didn't always want to answer. Why did I feel fear there? Why did I avoid conflict here? What assumptions drove my choices? One evening, after a particularly tense meeting, he realized how often he had ignored the subtle signals of his own ego. A junior analyst had challenged him, respectfully, about a potential error in a strategy. Instead of listening, he had felt irritation rise, a flush of pride that made him defensive. Later, he saw it clearly: it was his mind resisting the truth. He wrote in his notebook, "The mind hides the truth even from itself." That line became a mantra. Ray began experimenting with ways to expose his own biases and blind spots. He recorded his thoughts, questioned his beliefs, and even sought critique from colleagues he trusted, people who wouldn't hesitate to confront him. The process was uncomfortable, sometimes humiliating, but necessary. He realized that principles weren't just external rules for life and work, they were tools to confront his own nature. Without acknowledging his weaknesses, no principle could hold. Without facing his fears and patterns, he risked repeating the same mistakes endlessly. At Bridgewater, he began introducing exercises that mirrored this self-scrutiny. Team members were encouraged not just to analyze strategies and decisions, but to analyze themselves. If we can't see our own flaws, he told them, we will project them onto everything else. It was a culture shock for some. People were used to hiding insecurities, glossing over errors, pretending confidence. But the mirror Ray held up forced them to confront what they often ignored: their own thoughts, biases, and patterns. Ray became fascinated with the human mind, the delicate interplay of rational thought and emotional impulse. He observed how even brilliant people could sabotage themselves, how fear and pride shaped actions more than logic ever could. Each discovery added to his understanding of the inner machine that drove decisions. He remembered a time early in his career when a sudden market swing had rattled him. His instinct was to panic, to act quickly without analysis. Later, in reflection, he saw the pattern: fear had overridden reason. That memory became a lesson, one he repeated to himself countless times: observe the impulse. Question the reaction. Don't be the victim of your own mind. This inner work was not easy. Many nights, he stared at his reflection in the darkened glass of his window, wondering how much of his mind was truly his own, and how much was shaped by habit, pride, and fear. Each time he found a bias, he felt both relief and unease: relief that he could see it, unease that it had controlled him without notice. Bridgewater grew stronger as a result. Decisions became sharper, arguments cleaner, mistakes fewer. Employees began to mirror his discipline, analyzing not just strategies, but their own reactions. The company became a collective machine of thinking, each member aware of their strengths and weaknesses, constantly learning, constantly adjusting. Yet Ray felt a persistent tension. Understanding the mind's machinery revealed patterns, yes, but also the limits of control. People could still surprise him. Markets could still move in unpredictable ways. Life could still intervene in ways no principle could anticipate. One night, while reviewing a complex market model, Ray paused. He realized that even the best system, Bridgewater's, his own, was only as strong as the people who operated it. A brilliant machine could fail if the operators ignored their own flaws, their own fears, their own blind spots. He wrote, "To master reality, you must first master yourself." The thought lingered in his mind, a quiet warning. Mastery was never complete. Learning was never finished. There was always another bias to uncover, another impulse to examine, another hidden assumption to confront. In the reflection of his window, he saw the city lights flicker like a constellation of human activity, people moving, thinking, making choices, some wise, some foolish. He felt the fragile weight of responsibility pressing on him, to guide his team, to guide his company, to guide himself. And yet, for the first time, he also felt something new, a subtle sense of power. Not power over others, but over himself. For if he could see the machinery of his own mind, he could navigate the world with clarity few ever achieved. But clarity was dangerous too. Seeing everything so sharply left no illusions, no soft edges. The world appeared both magnificent and ruthless. One misstep, one unexamined impulse, could undo months, years, or decades of work. As Ray closed his notebook that night, he felt the thrill and fear of what lay ahead. The mirror of the mind was merciless, but it was also a key. A key to decisions, to leadership, to life. He didn't yet know what challenges awaited him, but he felt their approach, faint at first, like the whisper of wind before a storm. And somewhere deep inside, he knew the next trial would test not just his intellect, but the courage of his own heart. Chapter 6, Pain as a Teacher. The night had fallen over Bridgewater, leaving only the hum of computers and the faint rustle of papers to fill the air. Ray sat alone in his office, the glow of his desk lamp casting long shadows across the room. His mind wasn't on strategies, charts, or market forecasts tonight. It was on something far older, far more elemental, pain. He remembered the first time he had truly felt it, the sting of failure that had stripped away his confidence like bark from a tree. The collapse of his early career had burned through his pride, leaving him raw and exposed. At the time, it had seemed unbearable. But now, years later, he could see it differently. That pain had been a teacher. Harsh, unyielding, but honest. He turned to his notebook and wrote, "Pain is the signal. Reflection is the map. Progress is the path." It was simple, yet profound. Every lesson he had learned, the successes, the failures, the crises, had followed this pattern. He began to study it more deliberately. Each mistake, each disappointment, each loss, became an opportunity to understand himself and the world better. At Bridgewater, he shared this philosophy openly. When an investment failed, when a strategy went wrong, the conversation wasn't about blame. It was about understanding. Why had it failed? Which assumptions were wrong? Which human impulses had interfered? The first time he applied this fully was with a junior manager who had made a significant error in a trade. Normally, Ray would have felt anger, frustration, or disappointment. But instead, he asked questions calmly, guiding the young man to examine the choices that led to the mistake. "What did you feel when you made the decision?" Ray asked. "I thought it was right," the young man admitted, "but I ignored the warning signs." "And why?" The explanation revealed fear and overconfidence, a familiar combination. Ray nodded. "Good. Now you see. That feeling is a teacher. Pain shows you where the machine of reality didn't match your perception." By the end of the conversation, the junior manager wasn't ashamed, he was enlightened. He understood, for the first time, that failure wasn't a verdict. It was data. A clue. A lesson waiting to be understood. Ray began to apply this principle to himself as well. Every morning, he reviewed his own mistakes. Every night, he reflected on moments when his ego or emotions had overridden rational thought. He tracked patterns, identified biases, and wrote principles to prevent the same errors from recurring. Pain became a compass. It pointed him to the areas of his life and work that required attention. And as he embraced it, he noticed something remarkable. The more he leaned into the discomfort, the stronger he became. Fear and failure lost their power because he no longer resisted them. They were part of the process, but the lesson was not easy. Bridgewater's culture of radical truth meant that pain was magnified. Mistakes were visible to all. Arguments over decisions became public forums for analysis, scrutiny, and sometimes, harsh judgment. Many employees struggled under this relentless exposure. Ray understood this. He watched as people broke down, as tempers flared, as doubt seeped in. And he realized that for the system to work, individuals had to embrace the discomfort willingly. They had to accept pain as a teacher rather than a punishment. He began introducing rituals to help the team process it. After a failure, they would gather, dissect the event, trace the decision tree, and identify the emotional triggers. It was painstaking, exhausting, sometimes demoralizing, but it worked. Each member began to see mistakes not as setbacks, but as stepping stones. One particularly harsh day, after a failed strategy cost the company millions, the tension in the office was electric. The air was thick with anxiety, voices raised, ideas clashing. Ray remained calm, observing, guiding everyone. He said finally, "We need to understand why this happened. What were the signals we ignored? What assumptions failed us?" The room went silent. Slowly, hands were raised. People spoke. Arguments turned into analysis. Fear turned into understanding. By the end of the day, the team had discovered the weak points in their reasoning, documented them, and developed methods to prevent similar errors. Ray watched it unfold, a quiet smile on his face. Pain had done its work again, but even as the lesson settled, a new awareness crept into his mind. Pain was not just a tool for learning, it was also a warning. It revealed the fragility of assumptions, the limits of control, the vulnerability inherent in every decision. No matter how rigorous the principles, the machine of reality could surprise them at any moment, and that realization gnawed at him. Success had made them confident. Systems had made them powerful. But pain reminded them that they were still human, still fallible, still vulnerable to forces they could neither predict nor control. Late that night, as rain tapped against the windows and the city outside blurred into silver streaks, Ray reflected on the day. He had learned, once again, that avoiding pain was useless. Denying it was dangerous. Only by embracing it, by feeling it, studying it, learning from it, could he move forward. He wrote one final line in his notebook before heading home: "The pain you resist becomes the prison you live in. The pain you embrace becomes the path you walk." As he closed the notebook and stood, a sense of resolve settled over him. Bridgewater was growing, his principles were taking shape, and his team was learning the language of reality. But somewhere, out there, the world was preparing a new kind of challenge, one that would test the limits of their understanding, the strength of their principles, and the courage with which they faced pain. And Ray knew, deep down, that the next lesson would be the hardest yet. Chapter 7: The Power of Principles. The early morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Ray's office, painting the walls with a warm, golden hue. He sat at his desk, notebook open, pen scattered, and a quiet determination in his eyes. Years of reflection, failure, triumph, and observation had accumulated into something more than experience. It had begun to take shape as a set of rules, a framework, a map for navigating reality itself. He called them principles. These weren't abstract ideas or motivational slogans. They were distilled lessons from pain, reflection, and relentless observation. Each one was born from a moment when life had refused to bend to expectation, when a mistake had revealed a hidden truth, when failure had whispered secrets he could no longer ignore. Ray began by writing them down for himself, crafting each one with precision. Pain plus reflection equals progress. Embrace reality and deal with it. Understand that people are wired differently. Each line was simple, but beneath it lay years of observation, repeated failures, and hard-won understanding. He realized that principles were more than guidance, they were tools for decision-making. Life, work, relationships, markets, all could be approached systematically if one had the right operating rules. The machine of reality, he saw now, was complex but not unknowable. Principles were the gears, the levers, the instruments for navigating it. Bridgewater became the laboratory for these ideas. Meetings, arguments, and decisions were framed by principles. They weren't just taught, they were applied. Employees used them as reference points, testing assumptions against them, measuring choices by them, and learning through them. One morning, Ray gathered the leadership team around the table. "We've learned a lot about reality, about pain, and about ourselves," he said. "Now it's time to codify what we know. Not for me, not for the company, but for each of you, so that decisions can be guided by truth, not ego." He handed out notebooks filled with principles he had written. Each person read them quietly, some skeptical, some awed. "These are the operating rules of the company," he explained. "But more importantly, they are rules for your own thinking. Use them. Test them. Improve them. And when you fail, let them guide you back." The first principle on the list made some pause. Truth is the ultimate weapon and the ultimate shield. They debated, questioned, argued, dissected it. Ray encouraged it. Every principle was meant to be tested, not accepted blindly. Every argument was data, every discussion a way to refine understanding. Over time, the principles transformed the culture. Mistakes became less about blame and more about discovery. Decisions became more objective, less swayed by emotion. Conflicts, once heated and destructive, became structured debates grounded in rational analysis. Ray observed as employees began to internalize the rules, applying them to personal challenges as well. They used them to navigate relationships, to manage emotions, to handle stress. Principles weren't just company tools, they were life tools, and yet, the power of principles came with responsibility. They required discipline, humility, and honesty. Misuse could lead to arrogance, rigidity, or moral blindness. Ray understood this better than anyone. Principles were only as strong as the person applying them. One evening, after a particularly intense week of analysis and debate, Ray sat alone, reflecting on the journey. He thought about the collapse of his early career, the nights of self-doubt, the lessons learned through failure, the painstaking work of understanding the machine of reality and the machinery of the mind. Principles had emerged from all of it. They were the crystallization of experience into actionable wisdom. He wrote in his notebook, "Principles aren't a guarantee of success. They are a map. The journey is still yours to walk." As Bridgewater continued to grow, Ray noticed that the principles also attracted a certain kind of person, those willing to embrace truth, to face pain, to learn relentlessly. Others, unwilling to engage with the rigor, drifted away. But the team that remained became extraordinary. Each member, guided by principles, became a sharper, wiser, more resilient thinker. Still, even as the system worked, Ray felt the pull of something greater. Principles, for all their power, could not account for the unpredictable chaos of the world outside. Markets shifted, governments acted, human emotion surged. No framework, no matter how elegant, could completely tame reality. He began to explore ways to make principles dynamic, tools that could adapt, evolve, and grow with the world, just as humans do. He encouraged his team to challenge them, refine them, and even discard what no longer served. The process was rigorous, sometimes exhausting, but it kept the system alive. Late one night, as he sat in his office listening to the city hum, Ray realized the deepest truth yet: principles worked not because they provided certainty, but because they allowed clarity in uncertainty. They didn't remove risk, they made it navigable. They didn't guarantee success, they ensured learning, adaptation, and resilience. And somewhere in the quiet hum of the office, Ray felt a thrill of anticipation. Bridgewater was not just a company anymore, it was a living, breathing system for thinking. A machine powered by principles, shaped by reality, and driven by human beings learning to understand themselves and the world. Yet even as he closed his notebook and prepared to leave, a shadow flickered in his mind. The power of principles was immense, but what would happen when the world tested them in ways he had never imagined? When reality struck harder than ever before, the question lingered, unspoken but undeniable, like the distant rumble of a storm on the horizon. Chapter 8, The Relentless Test. The sky over New York was heavy with gray, a low cloud pressing down as if warning the city of what was to come. Inside Bridgewater, the atmosphere was tense but disciplined. Ray walked through the office, observing the team as they studied markets, reports, and data streams. Something had shifted in the world outside, the kind of shift that no model, no prediction, could fully contain. The test had arrived. A major economic shock rippled through global markets, subtle at first, then violent, as though a hidden hand had pulled a lever unseen. Stocks plummeted, currencies wavered, and confidence evaporated in hours. Most firms panicked. Executives shouted, analysts scrambled, traders acted impulsively, and chaos spread like wildfire. Bridgewater, however, was different. Ray had prepared for this, not in specifics, but in mindset. Principles weren't predictions, they were guides for navigating uncertainty. He had taught his team to see reality clearly, to embrace pain, and to analyze decisions without ego. Now, they would test every lesson, every rule, every principle he had painstakingly built. The office was electric. Whiteboards were filled with charts, graphs, and projections. Voices rose in precise debates, not shouting but urgent, analytical, structured. Ray moved between teams, asking questions, challenging assumptions, testing logic. "Where is the failure in this model?" he asked. "What are we missing? What emotions are influencing decisions?" Each person followed their training. Mistakes were identified quickly. Assumptions were challenged rigorously. Decisions were made calmly, even under pressure that would have crushed lesser firms. Bridgewater's system wasn't perfect, but it was alive. It adapted. It learned. And for the first time, its strength became undeniable. Hours turned into days. The external world continued its frenzy. Other firms faltered. Clients panicked. Rumors swirled. Yet inside Bridgewater, a strange sense of order prevailed. People were tense, yes, exhausted and anxious, but not frantic. They relied on principles. They relied on each other. Ray observed it all with a mixture of pride and caution. Principles had worked, but the test wasn't over. The market could still do something unexpected. A miscalculation here, a hidden bias there, could undo months of careful preparation. He reminded himself that success in this storm didn't mean mastery, it meant survival. During a late-night meeting, a young analyst approached him quietly. "Ray," she said, "I'm seeing something that doesn't fit our model. I think we've overlooked a critical variable." He leaned over the chart she had prepared. Her observation was subtle but crucial, something that could have caused a major loss if ignored. Ray smiled faintly, admiration in his eyes. "Good," he said. "This is exactly why we operate the way we do. Reality will always surprise us, but if we see it clearly, we can respond." The hours stretched into a week. Bridgewater weathered the storm better than almost any other firm. The principles had held under extreme pressure. Mistakes were fewer, reactions steadier, decisions sharper. Ray's system had been tested, and it had passed, but the experience left its mark. He noticed the exhaustion in his team, the weariness behind their focused eyes. He saw the weight of responsibility, the constant mental strain. Principles could guide decisions, yes, but they couldn't remove human vulnerability. Even the strongest machines required care, rest, and recalibration. That night, Ray sat alone in his office, the city's lights glimmering like a constellation below him. He reflected on the test, on the lessons the market had delivered. Pain had arrived uninvited, as it always does, but this time it had been anticipated, analyzed, and transformed into growth. He wrote in his notebook, "Tests are relentless. Reality is indifferent. But preparation and clarity can turn trials into triumph." As he closed the notebook, a subtle unease lingered. The storm outside had been severe, but storms were never predictable. Bridgewater had survived this one, but what about the next? He understood something crucial. Principles provided power, but they did not grant immunity. The machine of reality was vast, complex, and often cruel. The test would come again, in forms they could not yet imagine, and they would have to be ready, not just with knowledge, but with courage. Ray stood by the window, looking out over the restless city. Somewhere in that mass of lights and movement, another challenge was already forming, unseen, unannounced, waiting for the moment to strike. And deep inside, he felt the familiar stir of anticipation, the tension before the next trial, the pull of the unknown, the knowledge that survival demanded constant vigilance, constant adaptation, and a willingness to face pain head-on. Bridgewater had endured the first storm. But the world had not yet revealed its full fury. Chapter 9, The Architecture of Decision. The office hummed with a quiet intensity, a low vibration of focus that filled every corner of Bridgewater. Ray walked through the rows of desks, observing his team as they pored over charts, data models, and strategy proposals. The storm had passed, or at least the visible chaos, but the lessons remained, etched into every process, every discussion, every decision. Ray had realized something crucial during the recent market upheaval. Principles alone were powerful, but without structure, even the wisest people could falter. Systems had to be built not just to respond to reality, but to anticipate it. Decisions had to be made almost automatically, guided by design, not impulse. He called it the architecture of decision. In the conference room, he spread a large sheet across the table. Lines, arrows, and nodes formed an intricate web of cause and effect. Every potential decision, every possible outcome, every human variable had its place in the diagram. It looked overwhelming, but to Ray, it was clarity itself. "This," he said, pointing to the network of connections, "is how we ensure the right decisions happen, even under pressure." The system catches what individuals might miss. It highlights assumptions. It anticipates mistakes. And it forces us to confront reality before action is taken. He watched as the team leaned in, some skeptical, some awed. The architecture wasn't rigid, it was adaptive. Rules were embedded, but they could evolve. Failures were anticipated, feedback loops built in, and lessons from every mistake became permanent features of the system. Ray began introducing decision protocols at every level. Each member of the team had clear steps to follow, a checklist grounded in principles. Decisions were dissected into components, facts, assumptions, risks, potential biases, and consequences. Every choice had to survive the scrutiny of the system before it could be executed. It wasn't just about efficiency, it was about resilience. The architecture turned human weakness into strength. Impulses were tempered by process, emotions checked by logic, and errors caught before they could escalate. One afternoon, during a tense simulation exercise, a team member identified a potential error in a high-stakes strategy. Normally, a decision like that might have triggered panic, hasty action, or finger-pointing. But under the architecture of decision, the error was flagged, analyzed, and corrected before it reached execution. The team moved calmly, efficiently, almost mechanically. Success was no longer chance, it was built into the process. Ray realized that the architecture also created freedom. By providing structure, it allowed people to act without hesitation, to innovate without fear of catastrophic mistakes, to experiment within boundaries that protected the system. Creativity thrived, not despite rules, but because of them. He also began to see its power beyond the office. Decisions about life, relationships, and personal growth could be approached the same way. The architecture was scalable, it could guide humans through any complex system, internal or external. Principles were the foundation, structure was the framework, thoughtful execution was the engine. But the more he developed the system, the more he understood a deeper truth: architecture could not remove unpredictability entirely. Human nature, markets, and the world itself were still wild, often irrational, and occasionally cruel. The architecture mitigated risk, it did not eliminate it. Late one evening, Ray sat alone, reviewing the new protocols. The glow of the city reflected in his eyes, each light a reminder of the vast, unpredictable machine outside. He realized that even the most meticulous structures could be tested in ways he had not yet imagined. He wrote in his notebook, "Structure turns knowledge into action, principles into power, and chaos into manageable risk. But it demands vigilance. The system only works if humans work with it, not against it." As he leaned back, exhaustion creeping in, he felt a quiet thrill. The architecture of decision wasn't just a method, it was a philosophy. It was a way to navigate the world with clarity, discipline, and courage. It allowed Bridgewater to become more than a firm, it became a system capable of handling challenges far beyond ordinary capacity. Yet even as he reflected, a shadow stirred in the corners of his mind. Success had built the framework, but the world outside was growing restless, unpredictable. The next test would not be a small ripple, it would be a tidal wave, and the architecture would be pushed to its limits. Ray closed his notebook, feeling the familiar mix of anticipation and tension. The machine of reality, for all its logic and predictability, would soon demand more than knowledge and structure. It would demand insight, adaptability, and the courage to confront the unknown. And somewhere, in the quiet hum of the office, he could sense the first tremors of that next challenge forming, unseen, unannounced, inevitable. Chapter 10: The Edge of Reality. The morning light barely pierced the heavy clouds hanging over Bridgewater's headquarters. Inside, the office was unusually still. Usually, the hum of activity, the low chatter, the tapping of keyboards, and the occasional laugh filled the space. Today, there was tension in the air, a quiet awareness that something was coming, something that no system, no principle, no architecture could fully anticipate. Ray arrived early, notebook in hand, moving slowly through the rows of desks. The storm outside the office had ended, but the aftershocks in the market were intensifying. Small anomalies, at first almost invisible, began to ripple through global exchanges: sudden currency swings, unexpected commodity shortages, subtle shifts in interest rates. Most observers would have ignored them, but Ray saw the patterns. The edge of reality had arrived. He gathered his team in the main conference room. Screens flickered with data, charts, and projections. Each anomaly was dissected, tested, analyzed. Every principle, every rule, every protocol of the architecture was called into play. The team had survived previous shocks, but this was different. The chaos wasn't just in the markets, it was in human behavior. Panic, rumor, and overreaction were accelerating faster than models could predict. "Look," Ray said, pointing to a series of numbers and graphs, "these aren't just random fluctuations. Something is driving this. And if we don't see it clearly, it will overwhelm us." The team leaned in, tension etched into their faces. Analysts cross-referenced data, traced connections, and challenged assumptions. For the first time, even the architecture seemed strained. Decisions that usually flowed with predictable logic now required constant adjustment, constant vigilance, constant insight. Hours passed like minutes. Mistakes were caught quickly, but each discovery revealed another hidden variable. It felt like navigating a labyrinth that reshaped itself with every step. The team was sharp, disciplined, and focused, but the edge of reality was pushing them harder than ever before. Ray watched closely, noting not just the data, but the people. Fatigue, tension, and the weight of responsibility were visible. Yet in the strain, he saw courage and clarity. Principles had guided them this far, and the architecture had held, but only because the human element remained engaged, thoughtful, and adaptive. Late that night, after a particularly intense round of analysis, a senior partner spoke up. "Ray, this is unlike anything we've prepared for. Our models, the principles, even the architecture, they're all being stretched to the limit." Ray nodded slowly. "That's the point. Reality doesn't wait for preparation. It doesn't bend to our rules. The edge is where principles and architecture meet the unpredictable. That's where true learning happens." The night stretched on, filled with careful calculations, heated debates, and constant adjustments. Bridges were built between ideas, gaps were filled, assumptions challenged. The team operated like a single organism, each part aware of the other, each movement deliberate, each decision tested against the twin standards of truth and reality. By dawn, a fragile equilibrium emerged. The markets were still volatile, the world still chaotic, but Bridgewater had adapted. The architecture had absorbed the shocks. Principles had guided action. And the human element, the courage, the discipline, the insight, had carried them through the edge of uncertainty. Ray stepped out onto the balcony for a breath of air. The city below was waking, lights flickering, streets filling with movement. He felt both exhaustion and exhilaration. They had survived, yes, but survival was only the beginning. The edge had revealed limits, limits of models, limits of assumptions, limits of the human mind. And those limits demanded vigilance, reflection, and constant evolution. He returned to his office, notebook open, and wrote, "The edge is where we see reality most clearly. It is where preparation meets unpredictability, and where courage defines outcome." As he wrote, a quiet unease lingered in the room. The edge had tested them, but it had also exposed new vulnerabilities. Hidden patterns, unknown variables, human flaws, they all waited, subtle and patient, for the next challenge. Ray closed his notebook, feeling the weight of responsibility pressing down. The edge of reality was not a single moment, it was a state of being. And the world beyond Bridgewater's walls would always test them, in ways they could never fully anticipate. Somewhere, in the deep folds of the global system, another storm was forming. And when it struck, it would push the principles, the architecture, and the people who relied on them to the very limits of endurance. Ray looked out at the city, a quiet determination in his eyes. He knew they were ready, but he also knew that readiness was only the beginning. Chapter 11. The limits of control. Rain streaked down the glass of Bridgewater's towering windows, turning the city into a blur of shifting lights and shadowy shapes. Inside, the office was alive with a different kind of tension, a quiet, simmering unease. For all the principles, all the architecture, all the careful preparation, the world had presented something new, a challenge that could not be fully anticipated or contained. Ray moved through the office, notebook in hand, observing his team. They were efficient, precise, disciplined, but he could see it in their eyes, the uncertainty was unnerving. Even the best systems, even the sharpest minds, could only stretch so far before the unpredictable pushed back. The crisis began subtly. A set of interdependent economic shifts, barely noticeable at first, began to cascade. Small failures triggered larger ones. Decisions that had been reliable now yielded unexpected consequences. The architecture of decision flagged potential issues, but no structure, no principle, could fully account for the human reactions that followed: fear, doubt, hesitation. Ray gathered the leadership team. "We've encountered something that our models can't fully contain," he said calmly. "Our principles still apply, but we need to accept that control has limits. The machine of reality is not ours to command, it is ours to navigate." The room was silent for a moment. Then voices rose, first cautiously, then with increasing urgency. Strategies clashed. Emotions bubbled beneath the surface of logic. For the first time, Ray felt the strain of human fallibility pressing against the edges of his carefully constructed system. He realized that mastery was not about eliminating risk, controlling every variable, or forcing reality to conform to rules. Mastery was about understanding limits, knowing when to act, and accepting uncertainty without panic. Principles and architecture were guides, they were powerful, but they could not replace judgment, adaptability, and humility. Late into the night, Ray stayed at his desk, reviewing the unfolding crisis. He traced each decision, each reaction, each unexpected twist. Patterns emerged, yes, but so did randomness. The lesson was clear: humans, even when disciplined, are unpredictable. Systems, even when elegant, are not infallible. Reality is larger than any framework. He wrote in his notebook, control is an illusion. Understanding is our tool. Adaptation is our ally. The next day, he convened a meeting unlike any before. Every principle, every protocol, every assumption was on the table. The team dissected decisions not for blame, but for insight. Mistakes were analyzed for their human and systemic roots. fear, pride, and cognitive bias were examined as rigorously as market data. Through this, Ray noticed something extraordinary: his team began to rise to the challenge. By accepting the limits of control, by acknowledging uncertainty without panic, they became sharper, more inventive, more resilient. The architecture was no longer a cage, it was a platform. Principles were no longer rigid rules, they were instruments for navigating the unknown. But even as they adapted, Ray felt the weight of responsibility pressing heavier than ever. The world outside could not be predicted. Crises would continue to arrive, each more complex than the last. The edge between mastery and humility was thin, and one misstep could have consequences that no principal could fully anticipate. Late that night, he walked alone through the empty office, lights dimmed, monitors glowing faintly. The city outside shimmered through the rain-streaked windows, alive, indifferent, and vast. He understood that the most powerful lesson of all was not about markets, systems, or principles, it was about people, including himself. The human element could not be engineered away. It demanded care, reflection, and respect for its limits. He paused by the window and wrote one final note in his notebook: the measure of mastery is not control, it is awareness of limits, and the courage to act wisely within them. As he closed the notebook and turned toward the darkened office, a new thought lingered, heavy and inevitable. The world had shown its edge. The limits of control had been revealed. And beyond those limits, an even greater test waited, one that would challenge not just his systems, not just his principles, but the very essence of Bridgewater itself. Somewhere, quietly, the storm was gathering strength again. Chapter 12, The Eternal Pursuit. The sun rose slowly over the city, casting pale gold across the towering glass and steel of Bridgewater's headquarters. From his office high above, Ray watched the streets wake, the river glint in the morning light, the hum of 1,000 lives moving in countless directions. The world was alive, unpredictable, and relentless. And he knew it would always be this way. Years of experience, reflection, and trial had brought him here, not to certainty, not to mastery, but to understanding. Bridgewater had grown beyond a hedge fund. It was a living system, a network of principles, architecture, and human insight. It had survived storms, absorbed shocks, and endured the edge of reality. Yet the lessons never ended. The work was eternal. Ray walked through the office, notebook in hand, observing his team. Some were deep in thought, tracing variables and analyzing data. Others debated ideas with quiet intensity. All were applying principles, using the architecture of decision, but all were aware, as he was, that these tools were guides, not guarantees. Reality would always surprise, test, and challenge them. He paused at the window, reflecting on the journey. The principles he had distilled from failure, reflection, and observation were more than rules, they were a philosophy, a way to navigate life with clarity and courage. The architecture he had built was more than a system, it was a platform for human insight, resilience, and growth. But the most important lessons were never about money, markets, or systems. They were about people, including himself. He had learned that pain was a teacher, failure a guide, and humility a necessity. He had learned that understanding the mind, his own and others, was as critical as understanding the world outside. And he had learned that mastery was not control, but the ability to see clearly, act decisively, and adapt relentlessly. Ray opened his notebook and wrote slowly, deliberately: the pursuit never ends. Reality evolves. We evolve. Principles guide us, but learning defines us. He thought about the young analysts who had once challenged him, the colleagues who had debated him, the team that had weathered storms and crises. Each person had grown through struggle, reflection, and the discipline of applying principles. Bridgewater was alive because its people were learning, adapting, and thinking relentlessly. And yet, even as he reflected, he knew the work was far from complete. Markets would shift, crises would appear, human error would surface, and unforeseen chaos would strike again. The machine of reality was eternal, indifferent, and infinite. There would always be new lessons, new patterns to observe, new edges to confront. Ray smiled faintly. That was exactly how it should be. The pursuit of understanding, the pursuit of truth, the pursuit of excellence, these were the forces that kept him awake at night, inspired in the morning, and moving forward every day. It was not a destination, but a journey without end. He closed his notebook and stood, looking down at the city, at the countless lives intertwined with markets, systems, and human choice. Bridgewater was more than a company, it was a living testament to the power of learning, reflection, and courage. And he knew this, with absolute clarity, the journey would continue. The storms would come. Pain would arrive. Mistakes would be made. But each challenge was an opportunity, each failure a teacher, each decision a chance to apply principles and refine understanding. Ray turned back to the office, where his team was already preparing for the day. Their eyes were sharp, their minds alert, their spirits resilient. They had learned to navigate the edge of reality, to embrace the limits of control, and to act wisely in uncertainty. He felt a quiet satisfaction and a spark of anticipation. The pursuit of truth, learning, and mastery was eternal. There would always be new challenges, new discoveries, new horizons. And Bridgewater, guided by principles, strengthened by experience, and propelled by human insight, would face them. Ray picked up his notebook once more and wrote the final line for that morning: the path never ends, and the work never finishes. The pursuit is eternal, and we are here to follow it. Outside, the city moved, alive and indifferent. Inside, Bridgewater moved with it, a living system in harmony with the chaos, guided by principles, shaped by reality, and driven by the relentless pursuit of understanding. And somewhere, beyond the next challenge, the next storm, the next unknown, Ray felt certain of one thing: the journey would continue, and he, along with his team, would continue to meet it, awake, aware, and undaunted. At the world would always be unpredictable. But with truth, reflection, principles, and courage, they would always have a way forward. If you enjoyed this journey with us, tell me in the comments, what's the next audiobook you want to see retold like this? And don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that can change the way you think. Remember, momentum starts in your mind, and here at Momentum Mind, we help you build it, one story at a time.